I recently started coaching an athlete who we came to find was dealing with some like breathing related issues, and that we needed to address those if he was going to maximize his performance in the sport. So in this episode, I'm going to do a case study on this athlete. So let me give you some details about this athlete. I'm going to call him Evan, but that's not his real name. He's a 24-year-old male. He's got a training age of 11. Only 2 of those years have actually been in CrossFit, but he's been doing sports the majority of his life growing up. So he did track and field in high school, and his events were the 200 meter, the 400 meter, and triple jump. So all relatively shorter, higher output events. He was a baseball player in high school and also in his collegiate career. And he played center field there, which, again, if you look at that, you're looking at someone who's more powerful. They've got more fast twitch muscle fibers. They're biased towards power and power output to be successful in that sport, but also that position in particular. And then 2 years of blog style CrossFit after college. So kind of very similar story to me, actually, in the sense that you needed a competitive outlet and found CrossFit and kind of decided to get into it, and then started doing some classes, and then pretty quickly got into a blog style program and stuck with that for about 2 years before hiring a one-on-one coach, me. Yeah, and that was sort of like his story up to that point. So he historically has struggled with longer, more aerobic style events, kind of in the 15 plus minute range for CrossFit. And the interesting thing, and it's good to know, is that this was both cyclical and mixed events. So this didn't really matter if it was a road time trial that I gave him versus a CrossFit style test, like a 20-minute AMRAP, for example. His performance in both of those styles of events are below his other scores. I would say his strength level is very close, if not what it needs to be at a semifinal level. However, you're going to look at the leaderboard, you're going to see the majority of the points for both the 2021 and the 2022 CrossFit quarterfinals came from what I would call like a sustained power event. So in 2022, this was E3, the longer workout that was rope climb, wall balls, and shuttle runs. And then in 2021, the majority of his events came from E2 and E3, the GHD rope climb pistol one that extended out for most people to 20 minutes, and E3, which was the wall ball and row, more of an aerobic power event. But that was still over 10 minutes for him. So it's definitely that aerobic system is contributing a lot to all those. So again, another important context, like I mentioned, right, the events that are biasing power and like an unsustainable metabolic work rate, those he's really on track for where he needs to be in like the strength events and like those really short high work rate, more like sprinty type effort. He's right there with the other semifinal qualifications, semifinal bubble level athletes. So, he didn't like come to me and say, hey, I'm dealing with respiratory issues. It was more so like as we started having conversation and as we started to look at more of his data, this is sort of like emerged as like, okay, this is probably something that we're dealing with. So it was about conversation. We also did some additional testing. And I mean, the first thing that was obvious was that the aerobic prowess wasn't there where it needed to be. Like the aerobic development wasn't what it was. But also like just having him film his time trials, like I had him do a 5K time trial on the rower. I watched back at different points of that and I didn't watch the whole thing, but I kind of scrubbed through the video and I was watching. And one of the things that I noticed is that in prolonged high work rate bouts, so something like a 5K road time trial, he would kind of undulate. And these weren't like super obvious undulations, but it was clear when you could actually see his monitor on the video, is that he went from a high metabolic work rate and a high respiration rate to times where both of those would dip a little bit. So his pace would come down a little bit, but then also his breathing rate would start to drop a little bit as well. And he wouldn't maintain the full depths of those breaths as he went about that. So that's a problem if you're competing in a racing sport, right? Like the aerobic side of CrossFit is hugely important, as anybody who's been in it for any amount of time knows. So today I want to go over how I helped Evan with this problem and how I would think about addressing respiratory limitations in the CrossFit athlete. The fitness movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. Here are the steps that I went through with Evan. We started by adding volume. 2, we built his work rate, right? So in other words, the density of the work that he's actually performing. 3, we added dynamic contractions, or I should probably say we added more of them back in. And then 4 is working your way back to the sport. So those are the 4 steps that I typically think about when I'm thinking about developing someone's engine as a whole, but also dealing with the respiratory endurance limitations. For each of these, I also want to go over some of the biggest errors or mistakes that I see while other coaches or self-coach athletes are going through that process, stuff that I see a lot. So I recently wrote an article. It was called Building Respiratory Endurance in the CrossFit Athlete. It's got a very similar outline to the show that I'm going to go over today. So I'll link to that in the show notes. Also, I'm going to put all the examples and all of my notes. Actually, I look at the notes while I'm actually recording these. So if you want to see what I'm looking at on my screen as I'm going over this, yeah, head over to the website and check it out from there. So it's zorfitness.com/podcast/090. That'll get you to the show notes. Again, I'll link to that article as well. So let's dive into it. So training the breath in the context of sport, especially something like CrossFit, which is a racing or a capacity-based sport. The goal is to drive strength and endurance into the respiratory musculature, if we're talking about someone who's dealing with that as a problem. And in my experience, the only way to effectively do that is when the breath rate matches the work rate. For any reason that there's a mismatch in those two, like a breathing and metabolic mismatch, your performance is going to wane, right? It's going to decline. So there's obviously 2 scenarios that could happen here, right? One where you're breathing faster than your work rate, or your work rate is faster than your breathing. That's your 2 options for the mismatch. So let's go over that first example where we got breathing that is way faster than the work rate. A perfect example of this would be Wim Hof, right? Something that is superventilation, right? You are breathing much faster than your work rate. So in other words, you are going to either be seated, maybe standing, but often seated or laying down, and you're breathing at a very fast, very deep rate, right? So that the respiration level is really high, right? Your respiration rate is high, and also your tidal volume is high. So you're not just doing these little shallow breaths, right? They're full, deep breaths, and they're fast, right? So true hyperventilation. If you sustain that for any prolonged period of time, you're going to pass out, right? You're going to get super alkaline, and you're probably going to lose consciousness or just stop doing that, right? And that's why in something like Wim Hof, you have those breath holds in between, because that's actually sort of helps you balance out back to like more of a basically getting back to homeostasis. And if you sustain that, it's not going to go super well for you. So that's why you're going to incorporate breath holds into something like that. However, the issue, if you're dealing with an athlete and the athlete's in a sport and that's what you're training for, rather than just trying to get other benefits of something like Wim Hof, right? If you're training at someone like a CrossFit athlete, then if you want to work on their respiratory endurance, you have to stress that musculature to the point where it's actually going to drive adaptation. And likely that can't happen when you're taking those breaks in between, right? It would be like you're doing rowing intervals and you just stop every time you start to get fatigued, right? Like that's not going to drive enough fatigue into the system where you actually get good adaptation. It's the same thing here. Unless you have a work rate that's high enough where you can sustain a really fast, deep breath rate for a long period of time, you're not going to get the adaptation that you want or that you maybe would expect out of that. So I am not a fan of doing a lot of seated breath work for someone who's dealing with respiratory limitations in sport, right? There's other reasons why you might do that. Mindfulness, regulating state. There's a lot of tools that are underneath that, but I don't think the respiration in terms of like dealing with like the musculature itself is a good reason to do that. That's my opinion. So the other scenario would be that work rate is faster than your breathing. And this happens a lot in CrossFit. So this is where you need to be really careful about how you give and what you give to your athlete. I mean, number one, if the work rate's higher than the breathing rate, it could be because you're doing really just unsustainable work, right? You're working really fast. You're doing, minute intervals on the assault bike and you got a long rest period in between. You're going to be doing unsustainable work. There's a lot of anaerobic activity. So this could also be because of something like holding your breath while you're doing movements. So if you're doing really heavy thrusters, it's at 185, 125, you're going to have to hold your breath the majority of the bottom half of that movement so that you keep that trunk rigidity that you need to be able to move effectively through those. So it could be due to work rate. It could be due to just the nature of the movement that you're having to hold your breath. For Evan, and I think for other athletes like him, where the goal is to build that endurance, and most of the other qualities that are on the more shorter, higher power output end of the spectrum don't need as much development. The best way to do that is through giving them challenging bouts of work that allows for sustainable work rate. Combine that with another caveat being that there's steady blood flow to the muscles, right? That's super important. So there's always this interplay of the respiratory tissue itself and getting adaptations there, the lungs, right? Because those are two different things, right? The lungs are not a muscle, right? If we're going after respiratory endurance, we need to target the respiratory muscles, which create the negative pressure gradient and pull air into the lungs. And then the movement itself, right? So the movement that you're going to do, whatever you're doing, dictates how you breathe. The muscular tension requirement, right? So just because it's a burpee does not mean that that's the same, right? A bar-facing burpee is a burpee plus a jump, just like a burpee box jump over is a burpee and a jump. However, the requirement of tension of those two movements is not the same. So lungs and the respiratory tissue, the movement itself, the muscular tension requirement for that movement, and then the heart, right? And the heart is a very important one. We could also put in the circulatory system as well in that because vasodilation, constriction is going to affect that as well. So that being said, I don't want to go super deep into the physiology of this today. I wrote a whole book on that, an ebook, Breathwork for the Sport of Fitness. You can check it out on the website if you're interested. But let's actually get into how I dealt specifically with dealing with Evan's respiratory limitations and the way that we went about it. So the first place we did, step number one, is start by adding volume. So I want to start by reading a quote from the article that I wrote. The only way to effectively build aerobic prowess is by doing sustainable work. The only way to learn how to sustain work at a repeatable pace is to do a lot of contractions. The only way to do a lot of contractions is by adding volume. The only way to do more volume without severely overreaching is by reducing work rate, aka going slower. So I think a really practical way to think about this, and if you're trying to have a conversation and communicate with an athlete about what might be an appropriate volume for them, is if an athlete is scared, quote unquote scared, they treat a workout with additional respect because they are afraid, so to speak, of the volume in that workout, then they're not going to be able to race through that. And again, the sport is a racing sport. So if they are worried that they're not going to sustain across a bout of work because it's a lot of work, it's a lot of contractions, we need to adjust their a level that threshold occurs at, and the only way to do that is by giving them more. I think a good example would be people aren't competitive in a 5K race the first time they run it, right? If they've never run more than 2 miles and they go do a 5K, they're not going to be able to race that effectively. Likewise, if we have an athlete and they look at 30 ring muscle-ups in a workout and they're like, right? If they're a competitive athlete and they want to be competing at a high level, we need to do things to reset that threshold and to build that up. And really, the only way to do that is if you spend time building up contractions and likely getting at least 2 or past the functional volume of that movement. I think a good contrast to this would be if you're someone and you've done 70 muscle ups in a session before, you can look at a workout that's got 30 in it and you don't have to respect it as much in the sense that you're worried about how you have to pace it out and break it up just perfectly. You can say, okay, yes, I still have to strategize to get my best result on this, but I can race through it versus just trying to survive the volume. I also think this goes back to the fact that confidence and experience go hand in hand. It's really hard to have one without the other, right? So if you haven't experienced something, if you've never experienced what it's like to race a 5K, then it's really challenging to have confidence that you belong there. If you go to the games for the first time, unless for some reason you believe that you should have been there already, you typically don't have your greatest performance the first time you're there because you're not really sure if you belong. You don't have the experience. And because of that, you often lack the confidence. Even if you're telling yourself that you are confident, the deep down you often know that you're not, right? So those two things, confidence, experience, that's true for, maybe like competitive experiences, but it's also true for certain qualities as well, like endurance, right? If you haven't spent all this time building up these aerobic abilities, then you aren't going to be super confident when a workout comes out that happens. And confidence and experience, they go a long way. And also just, like endurance, like being able to sustain a high work rate without having these moments where it dips, like the power dips in the work. And that's what we saw with Evan, right? And that's why we kind of went about going and hitting it in this direction. But I think part of it is too because he just had that lower training age in the sport itself. Like he's been doing other sports for a long time that are more strength and power based, which is why he does well in those types of things. And those genetic components as well, obviously. However, he hasn't had this huge battery of experience, and part of that is playing into the confidence. He can't be as confident because he just doesn't have the experience to actually be able to express on a test like that. So again, if I'm thinking about Evan, and there's probably one of two reasons why his power could dip in a time trial, like say on that 5K row. This is a low scale environment. Like this would be one thing if it was like, Friendly Fran or something like that, where it's like a really high metabolic work rate and there's a lot of skill involved, right? And his butterfly kip is breaking down or something like that. But this is a relatively low skill environment, row time trial for an athlete like him. There's probably two reasons that this is happening. One is that the person's running up against their physiological capacity, right? Maybe they're maxing out their cardiac output. Maybe they're running into muscular endurance limitations. Maybe they're just at the extreme limits of their respiratory endurance and what they can sustain for a ventilation rate for a long period of time. So that's one thing, is that they're running into a physiological capacity. The second thing is that they just don't have the confidence in their system to continue to push hard that entire bout of work. And I think it doesn't really matter to me. Like I don't feel the need to tease out which one of those two things it is for an athlete like Evan, because likely I'm going to prescribe the same types of training either way, right? Because the types of things that I'm going to write for an athlete like him are going to get both the physiological and the psychological components, right? They're going to improve both of those. So from a physiological standpoint, something like cardiac output is probably going to be a significant thing that we try to improve, right? The amount that your heart is putting out per beat. And that is best developed through just total time under stress, right? And under stress, there's the time component, there's also a work rate component. So you want to try to maximize both of those the best you can. But again, with someone like Evan and most other athletes like this, especially in more of a preseason or off-season phase, you want to start by adding that volume, building out the time, especially on more cyclical pieces. So for an athlete like Evan, breathing hard, it's only helpful, and it's going to only allow for repeatability, sustainability if the heart is strong enough to get blood through the muscle, right? So to it, where it can actually deliver what it needs to deliver, but through it, right, making it that it can actually escape the other side and take the metabolic waste along with it so that that muscle can continue to work. So that can only happen if the heart is strong enough to punch through that. That means that you're going to have to spend a lot more time at a sustained metabolic rate where you're at a lower muscular tension and the heart can sort of collect wins, right? It's an easy way to think about it. It's no different than any other training quality. You need to stack successful sessions on top of each other, and that's what's going to allow for good adaptation. And you're not going to be overcoming a heart-related issue, so like a cardiac problem, by simply breathing in a certain way. Like there's no protocol that's going to get you to overcoming a cardiac limitation in the sport. So last thing I'll say here, and this is for really common that I see for a lot of people, is that if we see an athlete who's more power-based like Evan is, then we have often coaches that are prescribing all this zone work, which is super helpful and a good thing. However, it can't be all of the equation, because for an athlete like him, he's going to produce so much power when he goes back into sporting context, especially in CrossFit, that's not going to carry over super well for him. So you need to be able to do both of those things concurrently somehow, right? Figure out, how can I do this longer zone work combined with movements that he's actually going to be able to see in the sport so that it can translate back and carry over effectively. So the mistake I see most commonly at this step is writing only slow conditioning work for a more powerful athlete. So it's important to remember that, the goal of conditioning work or in quote unquote endurance work in the sport of CrossFit is different than other sports, because CrossFit is obviously unique, right? You got an array of patterns that you have to go through. You got all these different time domains and all these different patterns that you're going to be tested in. So I had a great conversation with Eoin Everard. He's a sub 4 minute miler, and we had a quick conversation about this topic in particular. Let's take a listen. There's this conversation that I have with a lot of coaches and even athletes who are kind of a little bit more cerebral, where it's like, do you want to train more of like what you're not as good at so that those things improve and it like isn't like a weakness anymore to you? So like for you, maybe it's like, would you train more of your aerobic system to try to bring that system up? Or would you rather lean into like what you're going to adapt to quicker, which again, for you might be like, I might run more of like these threshold and above type paces that are mimicking more of my race. And that'll be like more of a like powerful repeats. And now I'll adapt to that quicker. And I should instead focus more in that and lean into that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the latter, I believe is the only way to go. I believe like genetically people are set certain ways. And then you have to tailor. It's not even a thing of what do you want to, it's like you have to tailor training based on the type of runner the person is. And if you don't, they're never going to get the results they should.
Yeah. Super interesting.
Yeah. It's something I've been working. It's only kind of new in my head. It's just, it's how I started thinking about it is I went to a new coach who had been doing really well with some of my friends as I was trying to break, say, 14 minutes for 5K, 30 minutes for 10K. And he was completely aerobic, like just 5 by 7 minutes at marathon pace, like but off heart rate, lactic. And I was super fit. I was doing like 80 plus miles a week. I was like, my heart rates were coming down, and I went into races and I would be literally bombing out, like just terrible out the back because the pace felt crazy.
You just didn't feel like you had the gears.
I didn't have the gears. Like it was just whereas my friends who literally were doing the same training as me, they would just seem naturally be able to get on that pace. And then I was like, listen, I was chatting to another guy. It's like, I need to do some specific work. I do the specific work and it really works for me that year. The next year, the coach is like, okay, well, we'll all do that type of specific work. The guy who had ran well ran crap and I ran really well.
Yeah.
So it was just like, it's like, if you focus on the wrong things, not only this is a preference, in my opinion, this is like, it's like crucial that you do the right thing. Like if I got Jakob Ingebrigtsen and I ran him very hard, like relative to him, it would be crazy. Like I had a friend, Nick McCormack, he went to the 2012 Olympics, but in like so he had a coach that was very aerobic. Like his threshold was unbelievable. Like it's not hard to know what you're good at. If you would rather the longer like threshold work, if you're like, I can do that all day.
Yeah, if just someone's just like to ask you like, hey, which workout would you rather do, these intervals or this long slow run? Is that sort of what you mean?
100%. Like I'll pick intervals every day. Like I know I'll be good at them. If I've not trained hard for like a month, 6 weeks, I'll go down to the track and I know I'll do okay in the intervals. If I haven't done that in the aerobic, I'm going to be miles behind the guys. Yeah. So, but he was like that. He was trained aerobically. He ran 3:33. So this isn't a thing of like just being fast, like, or being long distance, but he was like a 5K runner in the end, like the way Jakob Ingebrigtsen is. He's not going to do really well at the 400.
Right.
They took him, he went into the UK training camp for a year because it's like, oh, you got your potential for, say, in 2009. They were doing loads of that neuromuscular work. So it was all like 6 by a K, hard enough, 5 by a mile, all like track sessions, basically, with like hill sessions. So much less aerobic work. He was running terribly. He got basically kicked out of that program, or he kind of left, went back to the coach. And within first year he came on, that was 2011. And then 2012, he qualified for the Olympics. because he was doing the type of work that works for him.
Mm.
And like with that guy, if we were doing intervals, I would be beating him. And he could, at that time, he was able to beat me by at least 10 seconds in a, like, we're not even in the same freaking city in terms of like ability at that time.
So I want to give two examples from Evan's training. This is more of a preseason or base building cycle for him. The first one was Monday evening, and the second one was Wednesday morning. And these are two different snapshots of giving him more of the endurance zone work, that base building work combined with things that are closely mimicking the sport, yet keep consistent blood flow, right? So those are the two big things that we're trying to balance here. Monday PM, rowing 60 minutes on an external clock at a zone 2 average heart rate. Every 5 minutes, he's going to complete 2 rounds of 6 no jump burpees, 8 ring rows, and 10 air squats. Wednesday morning, 15 rounds at 70-80% effort. So still not super high work rate, but the turnover will be fairly high. Okay. So again, 15 rounds, 4 box jump over step downs to 24 inches, 4 American kettlebell swings with a 53, 4 shoulder runs where 25 feet is 1 rep, 4 hang power snatches at 95, and 4 toes to bar. Rest 30 seconds between each of those rounds. So really small chunks of work, a lot of transition time, really can maintain a decent turnover and keep a consistent blood flow and pretty consistent heart rate throughout that piece. So step number 1 is building volume. Step number 2 is to build work rate. So aerobic base building and getting all those easy contractions, that's essential supportive work. Like that needs to happen, and that will allow for better expression of high effort metabolic work rates and events, right? Tests down the road. Again, that's the majority of CrossFit tests that you're going to see, but it's not enough on its own. You have to be able to take the athlete and slowly transition them from that off-season based work into more of their competitive sport. So for example, if I took an athlete like Evan, I took him from doing that aerobic base building, that endurance based work in the off season, and then just was like pushed him, launched him right back into like a CrossFit competition prep cycle where it's really high effort, Metcons, a lot of stronger contractions in the mixed work. He's going to get terrible results from that, right? Like the stuff he did in the off season is basically going to be wasted. There's going to be very little carryover from what he did there to what he's doing now. So the way that you kind of get around that is that you have to slowly iterate on each cycle that you're doing. So one cycle, you might be building that volume. It's more lower and slower work. And over time, like the next cycle, it's a little bit more intense. It may be pruning back that volume a little bit. And over time, it gets more and more and more reflective of the sport. And then it's like, oh yeah, now when I look back, this is very similar to what I'm actually going to be asked to do when it comes to me going out on the floor and competing at my best. So again, the way that I would do this is by starting by slowly pruning back that volume and replacing that machine-based cyclical work with movements and time domains that are going to be mirroring the sport more closely. And that's going to slowly morph and change over time. So this means that effort and power output, those two things are going to climb together. But the key thing of this aerobic training is still going to be there. And that is that it is repeatable, right? The repeatability is the most important thing. So we think about building work rate. An easy way to think about this is doing more things at like a threshold pace, which here I'm really kind of saying that's just sort of concepts for saying that things are repeatable and sustainable, not because there's no fatigue accumulating, but rather because you're injecting just the right amount of rest into those pieces where the athlete can perform the work, rest, and repeat it and match their scores or even improve on their scores or their times as they get deeper into the work, right? And that's the key way that you can see is repeatable or sustainable, is that they're matching or improving as they go across the work versus having their power output drop. Again, another thing that's important in this stage is that we're going to do less things that are based on heart rate or based on maybe like time trial paces and things like that. So it's less physiological driven and more driven based on their times, their scores, the performance orientation of that work. And also there's going to be more things that are task or time based. There's going to be more things that are executed for time at a higher RPE, or variations of things that are more time based basically thinking of this as like different ways that you could work AMRAPs. So in this performance-focused work, right, the athlete, in order to be successful, has to sustain a high ventilation rate. So an athlete like Evan, and I know this because we've had conversations together, it's like he's building confidence. He feels more confident as he's being challenged. He's like having challenge. He's having success, right? He's able to express the work and repeat it. That's allowing him to feel more ready for his season and be able to have the confidence that he needs and the capacity that he needs to express on something like the time trial before we saw those dips in power. So here's an example from this type of training. Again, contrasting this from maybe the sport where we're headed versus the more off-season based work where we're at before. Every 10 minutes for 5 sets, they'll be doing a 5-minute AMRAP at 85% effort. So 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off for 5 total times. 15 cal row, 12 wall balls, 9 burpees over the row rail. And between those sets, he's going to be riding the air bike at a recovery pace. And the goal when he gets on the bike is to return back to nasal breathing as quickly as possible, provided he doesn't feel like he's suffocating while he does that. So the mistake that I see here most often, and this is more so geared towards coaches, is that they prioritize the progression over the adaptation rate of the athlete. So what I see a lot of times is coaches get this idea in their head of like this progression they want to run an athlete through. And it's like, well, I'm going to hold this progression no matter what. And they don't really allow the athlete feedback of how it actually went to dictate how things go. Like you should have an idea of where you want to take the progression, but then ultimately the path that you take should be dictated by the athlete's performance. It's basically the idea of athlete-centric coaching or reactive periodization, which I talked about in episode 76, if you want to listen. Step number 3 is adding dynamic contractions. We're adding more dynamic contractions. Mastering breathing in CrossFit, you cannot do it with cyclical components only, right? You can't air bike or row your way to elite CrossFit performance because the majority of the tests have at least an acyclical component to them, right? They either involve, gymnastics, they involve weightlifting. And I would say, especially at qualifiers, open, quarterfinals, where we're not seeing a bunch of ergs being tested, we're not seeing outdoor running, we're not seeing biking being tested, right? The input of those cyclical components is even less into the scores. I'm not saying they're not useful training tools because they absolutely are. However, that's not how you're being tested. You're tested in largely acyclical movements. So yes, you can use cyclical movements to develop the ability to repeat and express and make acyclical contractions more sustainable. However, it's not enough, right? You have to be able to do both. You have to be able to make all the contractions of the actual movements that you're going to be doing in your competition easier. And the only way to do that is if you actually practice them. So this adding of dynamic contractions, it's adding in more varied patterning and doing it in more higher eccentric environments. So think about a 5K row versus Cindy, right? Time domain might not be super different. However, in terms of what's going on at the joint level, at the muscular level, at the level of the heart, those things are going to vary quite a bit. So, and additionally, like the volume tolerance of those specific movements and how you breathe in those specific movements are going to be very different. So you can't master breathing and acyclical work on the machines. It can help, it can aid that process, but it's not sufficient on its own. And again, the mistake that I see for this section in particular is failing to bridge between that lower eccentric environment of the more erg-based cyclical to the higher eccentric components of the sport. And again, this is something that I said before, it's basically a failure to balance and blend those two things where you go from one training program or cycle to the next. And it's a really clear, distinct change versus having those two things blend together. It needs to be a blending process in order for the athlete to carry those qualities over, unless they're just naturally gifted in that way, which happens sometimes. That's why you see some athletes, regardless of how things are kind of programmed or outlined, that they have success. However, if you're trying to have as many people that you coach and that you work with to be successful, that's a requirement, is that you blend those things, give them more time to adapt to the work that you're actually giving them. So if you add back in those high power, high eccentric movements too quickly, you're going to see two things. One is that the athlete is unable to express and actually recover from the work that they're putting out, right? Maybe they get DOMs, they're just not used to the volume. For whatever reason, they're not able to do it. Two is that they basically fail to drive the adaptations that they got from the easy aerobic work into the new movements, and they're not able to transfer that into the new context. So I'm going to go over week 1, pull a session from that, and week 4, pull a session from that, from Evan's training when we started to mix in, again, some of these higher output, higher eccentric environments back into his training, what it started to look like. Every 4 minutes for 7 to 9 sets, 7-5-3 with a bar facing burpee and toes to bar, and then max air bike cows until the 2-minute mark. So again, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off for 7 to 9 times, 7-5-3 bar facing burpee, toes to bar, and then remaining time air bike cows. And again, the goal here is to match or improve that score each time. So that was week 1 of that progression. Slowly building on that, slowly giving him more higher power output, higher eccentric components. Week 4, this is what it's looked like by the end of that progression. Every 5 minutes for 5 to 6 sets, 4, 3, 2, ring muscle up, burpee box jump over a 30-inch box, and then wall balls with a 20-pound ball to 10 feet until the 2-minute mark, with again the goal being to match or improve your score each set. So we took that bar facing burpee and we made it a burpee box jump over to a higher box. We took the toes to bar and we made it ring muscle up, right? And again, this is week 1 and week 4. There's a lot of iterations in between this. Assault bike, move that from a cyclical component to a wall ball, right? Still not a super tough contraction, but acyclical nonetheless. And then 4th and final step is to work your way back to the sport. My job as a coach, if you got to coach their job, is to help prepare you for your sport, right? That's what it comes down to, right? You need to be able to feel ready when you go to compete. And you will never be able to compete at your best if you have not mirrored what you're going to be asked to do out on the floor in your training and in the preparation that you're going about in your training. And that means sustained ventilation through acyclical, novel tasks to support a high metabolic work rate. That is not a luxury, right? That is a necessity. If you want to be good in this sport, if you want to be the best, you have to be able to do that. The biggest mistake I see here is athletes, and especially coaches, because there's the one who needs to dictate it to their athletes. They don't understand the difference between training and competing. The goal of training is to accumulate quality work, right? Stacking small wins where whatever metabolic or mechanical stress you're giving to the athlete. So like you just think of this as like if you're doing more engine-based work, right? More conditioning stuff and more strength building work. It only should be able to stress the athlete to the point where they're getting good adaptations out of it without going so far that it's detracting from their ability to come back and get more practice in, right? So they shouldn't be destroyed to detriment of their next session, right? They need to be able to come in and get another practice session in to be able to accumulate more work, to be able to accumulate another win, right? They need to be able to do that repeatedly over the course of their entire training season. And yes, there's going to become a time where for more advanced athletes, you're giving them a lot of challenge because that's what they need. And they can also express and repeat that and continue to get good training outcomes and continue to come back for their next session. But we just need to understand where an athlete is in that process and, again, where they're at in their time of year. We can't be giving training-based efforts to an athlete in their competition prep all the time, right? You need to test them sometimes. And likewise, and I think this is probably more often the scenario, is you can't be giving athletes competing type efforts when they're in more of an off-season phase. You have to allow them to accumulate submaximal work. So a coach really needs to understand what time of year they're in and how to best communicate that to their athletes so that the athlete actually knows the intention behind the work that they're putting in. Again, if we're competing, in stark contrast to what I just said, the goal of competing is to win, right? Is to be at your best. And, you know, I've had conversations with Evan and like that's sort of how it goes, right? It's like he wants to be at his best. Like he wants to go on the floor and be in the hunt to win. And he wanted a thought partner in that process, and that's why he came to me and why we're working through these things together, right? I listen to his feedback. He listens to the ideas and the things that I'm kind of directing towards him, and together we go about that process. And I would encourage, if you don't have someone in that process, find someone, even if it's not me, that can help you through that process and to come alongside you, right? If you want to see adaptations and success and things that you currently don't have, you have to do things that you have not done before or that you haven't done up to this point to push you to get you there, right? So that's my big picture thoughts and how I would think about addressing respiratory limitations for the CrossFit athlete. Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just found the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while and enjoying what you're hearing, I would encourage you to leave a rating or review for the show. It would definitely help us out. And lastly, if you're someone who does take your fitness seriously and cares about your performance deeply, I would encourage you to look into hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.